At the wedding reception in a historic Chicago hall, I felt my world tilt when my new daughter-in-law pulled the chair from under me, and I crashed to the floor. My palms slapped the polished hardwood, and for a moment the laughter of guests drowned out the thudding of my heart as my red dress bunched around my knees. As I pushed up with aching arms, Candace planted her heel near my hand and hissed, "Stay down there where you belong," loud enough for the head table to hear. Before I tell you exactly what happened next, please take a moment to subscribe so that you're the first to listen to these new stories as I post them here on the channel, and click the like button to show other moms with grown-up kids that we're all in this together. The humiliation burned hotter than the bruises blooming on my knees, and it was in that beat of stunned silence that I decided to bury the wedding gift I had planned for years. 8 years earlier, after my husband's funeral, I had stopped at a gas station off Interstate 55 and bought a lottery ticket on a whim with my last $5. When the numbers matched later that week, my hands trembled as I dialed the Illinois lottery office, realizing I was suddenly holding a life-changing fortune that I told no one about. My son Paul had moved out at 20, working long shifts at a Ford plant, and I tucked the winnings into a high-interest account at Chase, planning to surprise him when he married. Losing my husband John to a stroke had left an empty chair at our kitchen table, and the silence made me spend evenings with old photo albums and mugs of Folgers coffee. By the time Paul introduced me to Candace, my secret nest egg had grown, and I imagined handing him a check someday as a way of honoring his father's memory. Candace's first visit brought the smell of perfume too strong for my small bungalow, and a voice that seemed sweet but hovered just above a whisper, like she measured every word. She scanned the living room like she was appraising an estate sale, complimenting the fireplace mantel while making eye contact with Paul to measure his reactions. I chalked up her stiffness to nerves and offered iced tea in Pyrex glasses, ignoring how her manicured nails tapped impatiently against the table when I asked about her job. Paul explained she worked in marketing for a tech startup downtown and dreamed of a condo on Lakeshore Drive, and I smiled, grateful he had found someone who seemed driven. We moved to the backyard so Paul could show her the garden he and his father planted when he was 12, and Candace barely glanced at the roses before checking her phone. Little moments like that should have been red flags, but widowed mothers learn to swallow discomfort to keep peace, especially when their children beam with pride beside their partners. When they announced their engagement over grilled burgers at our picnic table, Candace's diamond flashed so brightly that it refracted sunlight onto the old deck chairs. In that same breath, she said they had booked a venue near Lincoln Park and hinted they were choosing a modern guest list to avoid drama, a phrase that slid under my skin. Paul squeezed my shoulder with his grease-stained fingers, still in his UAW work shirt from his shift-building Chevy Silverados, and whispered that the small ceremony would be intimate. My stomach tightened as Candace handed me a list of roles, delegating me to simple flower duties, while her mother oversaw the seating chart, and I bit my tongue to keep peace. That night, I sat at my kitchen table, sipping chamomile and flipping through the Silent No More channel on YouTube, where older women shared stories of being dismissed by their children. One video about a mother who spent her retirement on a dream house for her son, only to be shunned by his spouse, left me with a cold weight in my chest. The next morning, I decided to transfer a portion of my winnings into a separate Fidelity account with a beneficiary trust that listed only me, reinforcing that the funds remained mine until given. As weeks turned into months, Candace's messages about the wedding grew more exacting, from specifying the color of ribbons to emailing me PDF schedules with minute-by-minute timing. She called one Saturday while I was in the cereal aisle at a Kroger, her voice sweet as syrup as she asked if I could change the date of my annual doctor's appointment to accommodate her final tasting. I glanced at my watch and said yes, pushing my cart past a display of Campbell's soup cans, because at this point I still believed compromise would keep my son happy. Later that day, while loading bags into my Toyota Camry in the parking lot, my phone buzzed with a fraud alert from Chase that made my heart jump, only to realize it was a routine check. Standing there between parked cars, with Lake Michigan's breeze carrying the scent of exhaust, I took a deep breath and promised myself that after the wedding, I would finally rest easy. Months before the big day, Candace insisted we all attend a wine tasting in Napa, which I declined politely, citing my arthritis and the expense even though she knew about my frugality. Her response was a group text to Paul and me, hinting that maybe some people would be more supportive if they understood how important these experiences were to our generation. Paul tried to mediate, texting privately that Candace was under pressure and that his job at the Ford plant had layoffs coming, and I reassured him that stress can make people bristle. It was during that time that I noticed how often Candace referred to our money when talking about Paul's future, even though I knew their accounts were separate and he still used my old U.S. Bank debit card on occasion. On a rainy Tuesday in April, my landline rang while I was kneading dough, and Candace's mother's number lit up. She asked if I would mind if their family took over the front rows at the ceremony for their special guests. I wiped flour on my apron and forced a laugh, saying it was fine. But my eyes drifted to a framed photo of John at our wedding, his hand on mine, and my chest tightened. That night, I pulled out my old ledger and calculated how many times I'd stayed quiet to keep harmony, adding up the years of holidays spent bending to other people's expectations. By midsummer, Candace sent a spreadsheet detailing the cost of chair rentals and centerpieces, assigning me to pay for linens while she and her family covered the DJ and photographer. I wrote a check to the event company and dropped it off at the venue near Millennium Park, noting the arch ceilings and marble floors where my feet would later scrape as I fell. The day before the wedding, I picked up extra Tylenol at CVS, expecting to stand for hours, and I wondered if I should tell Paul about the $10 million held in the trust just waiting for him. I didn't, because part of the surprise was wrapped in love, and I wanted to see his face light up, but that secret now sat like a stone in my pocket. The morning of the ceremony dawned crisp, with sunlight shimmering off the river as I drove my Camry down Lakeshore Drive, the radio low, hands tapping the steering wheel in nervous rhythm. At the venue, staff dressed in black bustled between round tables, and the smell of fresh-cut hydrangeas mixed with the clink of glasses being arranged in perfect concentric circles. I placed the gift I had bought off their registry, a Cuisinart stand mixer, on the table and glanced at the card I had written, knowing it contained only warm wishes and not the secret check I had dreamed of adding. As guests arrived, Candace floated through the room in a satin robe, her hair pinned perfectly, offering air kisses while barely masking the tension at the corners of her mouth. Paul looked handsome in his tailored suit, but his shoulders seemed higher than usual, like he was bracing against wind, and his eyes flitted to Candace for approval when he greeted me. During the ceremony, I clutched my mother's handkerchief as they exchanged vows, and even though Candace flubbed Paul's middle name, he laughed nervously and squeezed her hands. After the dinner plates were cleared and the DJ switched from Frank Sinatra to current pop, I joined a small group of older relatives near the dance floor, smiling at a cousin's toddler twirling. Candace approached with a grin, and for a second I believed she wanted to dance with me, until she reached behind my chair under the guise of adjusting her train. I shifted my weight to stand, but before I could steady myself, she yanked the chair away, and my legs gave out as gravity dragged me down, my body colliding with the floor. Gasps erupted, then nervous laughter that cut off abruptly when Candace's high-pitched voice sliced through the music, commanding me to stay down, telling everyone I belonged there. The shock ricocheted through my bones, and from my spot on the ground, I could see the underside of the decorated tablecloth, the glint of my dropped earrings, and the disgusted smirk curling Candace's lips. Paul stood frozen, his mouth half open, hands at his sides, while our cousin James rushed over to help me up, but I waved him off because I needed a second to gather the pieces of my pride. As I rose slowly, I met Candace's gaze, and in that moment something inside me clicked, the years of compromise hardening into resolve like winter ice on Lake Michigan. I smoothed my dress, excused myself politely, and walked to the restroom where I locked the stall and let silent tears fall, each droplet extinguishing my intention to give them my fortune. The only sound was the hum of the venue's ventilation system, and I whispered to John's memory that his son had chosen a woman who would never respect the family that built him. When I dabbed my eyes and rejoined the reception, I held my head high and told Paul that my knee was fine, though my trust was fractured, and he nodded, distracted by Candace's pout. That night, when they left under a shower of sparklers, I waved along with everyone else, but inside I was drafting a new plan to protect myself and teach a lesson without breaking the law. At home, I sat at my oak table, opened my ledger, and wrote in bold letters, "Do not enable disrespect," then looked at the balance on my Fidelity account that had reached $10 million after 8 years of quiet growth. I made an appointment with my attorney at a downtown law firm to revise my estate plan, ensuring that my son was removed from immediate beneficiary status until he reconciled his priorities. We discussed how Illinois is a two-party consent state, so while I could document conversations, I needed clear permission before recording calls, and I resolved to rely on paper trails instead. My lawyer explained that any eviction proceedings would require proper notice and that removing someone from a home takes months, not days, and I nodded, absorbing the timeline for my unfolding strategy. I met with a financial advisor at Edward Jones, a kind woman with silver hair, who outlined how I could place funds in a revocable trust that allowed me to leverage assets without risking my own security. The next day, I visited the county clerk's office to request property records, my fingertips tracing old deeds, and I discovered that Candace's father co-signed on a mortgage for their downtown condo. Realizing that their dream home was financed by someone else gave me a way in, and I decided to purchase the note through a shell company, effectively becoming their mortgage holder. It required moving money from my Chase savings through a wire transfer that triggered a call from the bank manager, who reminded me that transfers over $50,000 would be held for verification for at least 3 business days. I authorized the transfer, answering security questions about my first car and the street where I grew up, aware that my Camry had fewer miles than the moral distance between us now. I also bought the vacant lot next to their condo through a public auction posted online, envisioning future construction that would block their view and create noise at inconvenient times. Meanwhile, I took out an insurance policy with State Farm on my own home, increasing coverage because the stress of this ordeal reminded me to secure my assets from any unforeseen claims. For weeks, I did not confront Paul or Candace, instead immersing myself in the fine print of contracts, learning that as the holder of their mortgage, I could call in clauses if payments were late. I started by sending a courtesy letter under the business name I created, notifying them that the mortgage servicer had changed, which is a standard practice in real estate transactions. Candace called me in a panic, not realizing I was behind the new company, and she ranted about incompetent banks while I listened calmly, swirling a spoon in my Land O'Lakes yogurt. She complained that she had to fill out new paperwork and grumbled about how older people make things hard, unaware that my signature authorized every line she was forced to initial. After that call, I went to Home Depot to pick up supplies for my own house repairs, wandering the aisles of paint and light bulbs, comforted by the smell of lumber and normalcy. At the checkout, a young cashier asked if I qualified for the senior discount, and I smiled, thinking about how age brings not just wisdom, but patience to plan long games. Part of my plan involved gently tightening the screws. When their monthly payment was 2 days late due to a holiday weekend, I issued a formal notice, just as any bank would, adding a small fee. Candace called Paul screaming, and he arrived at my house breathless, accusing me of enjoying their pain. And I calmly slid the mortgage contract across the table, pointing out that the clause was standard. He looked at the pages, his eyes darting across the legal jargon, and realized that they had indeed agreed to these terms. His shoulders slumped as he muttered that Candace insisted on this condo's location despite the cost. I reminded him that I changed the locks on my house after their wedding for my safety, and that under Illinois law, as the homeowner, I was entitled to control who had a key, which made him bristle. He told me Candace was pregnant, and the words hung in the air like steam over a pot, adding another layer of complexity to my already tangled feelings. My heart squeezed because becoming a grandmother had been a dream, but I also feared the child would be used as a pawn in their demands, and I resolved to keep my boundaries firm. I suggested we sit down with a neutral mediator at the courthouse to discuss expectations, and Paul agreed, scheduling a session for the following month because the court docket was full. In the meantime, Candace's anxiety spiraled. She posted on social media about unfair landlords and hinted that family members were sabotaging her life, garnering sympathy from her friends. I kept my own counsel, busying myself with Blue Apron meals and AARP articles about setting boundaries. And when neighbors asked, I simply said we were working things out. During the mediation session, a retired judge listened patiently as Paul and Candace complained about the payment schedule, and I calmly presented documentation showing that I had not violated any law. The judge explained that mortgage servicers have the right to enforce contracts, and that we were all adults who should read before signing, which made Candace flush and bite her lip. Paul glanced at me, and for the first time since the wedding, I saw a glimmer of the boy I raised, embarrassed by the public reprimand, but unwilling to voice it in front of his wife. When the session ended, I stepped outside into the autumn air, the smell of leaves mixing with exhaust from buses, and thought about how justice often looks like paperwork rather than drama. I had built a habit of drinking afternoon tea while watching the clock on my microwave, counting down the days until the next payment due, and when they were late again, I took the next legal step. My lawyer filed a notice of intent to accelerate the loan, which meant that if they missed another payment, I could demand the entire balance or initiate foreclosure, a process that would take months. I wasn't sure if I'd actually follow through, but the pressure was intended to force reflection, not ruin them, because I believed consequences should instruct rather than annihilate. On Halloween, while neighborhood kids in costumes knocked on doors for candy, Candace showed up unannounced on my porch, pregnant belly leading, wearing a faux fur coat and puffy eyes. She accused me of destroying her life and said she had recorded my last phone call as proof of harassment. And I reminded her gently that recording someone without consent in Illinois is illegal. Her face paled, and she stammered that she didn't know. And I told her I could have pressed charges, but chose instead to show her that playing with fire can burn everyone. She started to cry, not pretty tears, but messy sobs that shook her shoulders. And she admitted she felt insecure marrying into a family that she thought would judge her background. Her confession surprised me. Beneath the arrogance was a frightened woman who had grown up with a mother who criticized her weight and a father who left when she was 10. For a moment, I saw the girl she once was, and my anger softened, replaced by a sadness that so many women hurt other women because they themselves were wounded. We talked in my living room for hours, sipping hot cocoa and taking breaks when she needed to breathe. And slowly, a fragile truce formed between us. I told her about the time Paul drove our old Chevy to his first job and how he cried when the engine died on the freeway. And she laughed for the first time that night. When she asked why I hadn't given them a wedding gift, I told her about the lottery win and my plan to surprise them, and her jaw dropped as she realized what her actions cost them. Candace looked down at her hands and whispered that she had always felt like money could fill the void left by her father, and I replied that love fills voids, not checks. Paul arrived later to pick her up, and we all sat together quietly, the clock ticking on the wall, until he apologized for not defending me at the wedding. He said he had been frozen with fear of upsetting his wife and losing her, and I told him that choosing a spouse does not mean erasing your mother, but it does require balancing loyalty. Over the next weeks, we kept meeting, sometimes at a diner by the river where the smell of pancakes and bacon reminded me of simpler times, and we spoke honestly about expectations. I decided not to foreclose on their condo, instead restructuring the loan with a slightly higher rate and a mandatory financial counseling requirement through a nonprofit partnered with Wells Fargo. Candace bristled at first but agreed, and during the counseling, she learned basic budgeting and the importance of emergency savings, concepts she said no one had taught her. In one of our sessions, she thanked me for not publicly shaming her and for giving them a path forward, and I told her that consequences without redemption breed resentment. Around the same time, I heard a story on Silent No More about a mother who forgave too easily and was hurt again, and it reminded me to maintain healthy skepticism even as we rebuilt trust. We spent Christmas together that year in my living room with a fake tree from Michael's and ornaments Paul made in grade school, and Candace helped me bake cookies using my old crock-pot slow cooker to keep the cider warm. Their baby, a girl they named Grace, arrived in February, and when I held her tiny fingers, the bitterness of the past months melted like snow on my tongue. Candace asked if I would babysit when she returned to work, and I agreed but set boundaries. I would not be used as free daycare without respect, and they nodded understanding. By Grace's first birthday, we had fallen into a rhythm. They paid their mortgage on time, and I invested my remaining funds in a charitable trust supporting scholarships for girls in trade schools. Sometimes Candace slipped and reverted to old habits, like asking to borrow my credit card, and I would gently remind her that financial independence builds confidence, just like using a Swiffer keeps floors clean without depending on others. When Paul got a promotion at the Ford plant, moving from the assembly line to a supervisory position, he called me first and asked if I would come celebrate at a local diner, which I did happily. Over plates of meatloaf and mashed potatoes, he told me how he respected my resilience and admitted that he had been blinded by love and fear of confrontation. He thanked me for teaching him the importance of boundaries and for not cutting him off completely, and I squeezed his hand, feeling the calluses that reminded me of his father's hands. On the anniversary of John's death, we visited his grave together, bringing a bouquet of flowers from Publix, and Candace stood quietly beside us, holding Grace and bowing her head. I whispered to the marble that our family had been tested but survived, and the cool autumn wind carried away the lingering bitterness, like leaves skittering across a sidewalk. Though I never handed them a $10 million check, I did use portions of my winnings to renovate my house and fund a local women's shelter, finding joy in helping others reclaim dignity. Candace occasionally joked about the mystery money I withheld, but there was respect in her tone, and she never again made me feel small or out of place in my own family. Paul once asked if he would ever receive a large inheritance, and I told him the greatest inheritance is wisdom, though there might be funds later if he continued to honor family and handle finances responsibly. I kept some assets liquid in case of emergencies, aware that life can change quickly, but I felt peace knowing that I had channeled my anger into actions that protected me and taught lessons. Even now, years later, I sometimes replay the moment I hit the floor, not to reopen the wound, but to marvel at how far we all came from that humiliating instant. When my knee aches in the winter, I rub Voltaren on it and smile, remembering that this pain birthed a boundary that changed the trajectory of my relationship with my son and his wife. On quiet afternoons, I sip tea in my kitchen, the clock ticking and the scent of vanilla candles filling the room, and I write letters to Grace about perseverance and self-respect. I also volunteer at the family court as a peer advocate, helping other senior women understand the difference between supporting their children and enabling disrespectful behavior. Looking back, raising Paul as a single mother after John died meant wearing many hats, from nurse to mechanic to counselor, and those experiences hardened me in ways I never anticipated I'd need later when dealing with a daughter-in-law like Candace alone. I remember the way Paul would crawl into my bed after a nightmare, clutching his handmade blanket, and I'd tell him stories of resilience passed down from my own mother in Tennessee, knowing that generational strength would someday anchor him through storms of marriage and family discord. When John's heart attack struck suddenly on a humid August evening, the smell of barbecued ribs still hanging in the air from our dinner, I drove him to the hospital along empty streets and learned what it means to make life or death decisions alone in a brightly lit ER. In those hours in the sterile waiting room, I thought about the importance of health insurance and thanked the universe for our GEICO life policy, a small comfort that covered funeral expenses and prevented immediate financial ruin in the face of unbearable grief. After John's funeral at our church on the south side, I returned home to a mountain of condolence casseroles, Lysol wipes to scrub away spilled gravy, and the reality of paying bills with one income while still dreaming of Paul's future college education. I took extra shifts at the hospital, sat through long nights in the fluorescent light of a Walgreens pharmacy, when the nurse called in sick, and learned that exhaustion doesn't numb the ache of loss, but makes you determined to fight for stability. Paul flourished despite the void, joining the Boy Scouts, learning to tie knots and budget allowances, and he saved his paper route money from the Chicago Tribune to buy a used bike, which he named Betsy, as if it were a trusted friend. Our house buzzed with the sound of a landline and a clunky answering machine from AT&T, and I still remember the day my sister-in-law left a message suggesting I should date again, making me laugh and cry simultaneously as I scrubbed my sink with Comet. Years later, while cleaning out John's toolbox, I found an old Post-it note with a scribbled budget for Paul's college fund, and it lit a fire under me to invest wisely, which is why the anonymous lottery win felt like a divine gift. On the day I scratched off those numbers in the parking lot of a BP gas station, the humidity clung to my hair, and my hands shook so badly I almost dropped the ticket, stunned by the improbable zeros staring back at me. Claiming the prize required visiting a downtown office, showing identification, and meeting with a financial advisor who wore a crisp suit and recommended anonymity, and I felt like a secret agent as I deposited the check into a newly opened account at Bank of America. I drove home along Lakeshore Drive, the sun glinting off the water and my mind racing, thinking about how to hide the money without lying, and deciding to frame it as discipline until the right moment arrived. Back then, my kitchen table was covered with ledger sheets, a Hewlett-Packard calculator, and brochures from Fidelity, Charles Schwab, and Edward Jones, and I spent late nights learning about compound interest, mutual funds, and the volatility of the stock market through library books instead of fancy courses. Paul grew into a teenager with a taste for cheap skate shoes from Kohl's and an obsession with his first-generation iPod, blasting rock music while I cooked meatloaf. And I often wondered how he would someday balance independence with responsibility. He got his first job at a local Ace Hardware, stocking shelves with bolts and lawnmower blades, and he came home smelling like motor oil and pine, proud of his paycheck with his name on it, which he promptly placed in his Wells Fargo savings account. I surprised him with his father's old Ford keychain on his 18th birthday, attaching it to a used Pontiac we bought together from a neighbor and teaching him to drive stick shift through the winding parking lot of a closed Sears store. In those moments, I thought my biggest challenge would be watching him leave for college, not navigating the emotional minefield of a future daughter-in-law who viewed family traditions like quaint relics rather than sacred history. When Paul brought Candace to our house for the first time, I noted how her manicured fingers scrolled through Instagram even as I served homemade chicken pot pie, a recipe handed down through generations and baked in a Pyrex dish older than both of them combined. She wore a sleek blazer that spoke of corporate ambition, and while I admired her drive, I worried that her comment about preferring DoorDash to home cooking signaled a value disconnect that would become a chasm with time. During their courtship, I invited Candace to our annual family reunion at Starved Rock State Park, hoping shared hikes and potluck lunches would bond us. But she declined every invitation with excuses about work deadlines and industry happy hours that never seemed to end. Paul told me not to take it personally, that millennials communicate differently, and I smiled while internally listing the generational differences in my head, an exercise that would later help me understand the cultural gulf we needed to bridge. One evening, Candace called to ask which bank we used for Paul's old college fund, and when I told her we had accounts at U.S. Bank and Chase, she sighed and said she preferred digital-only banks, a casual comment that made me double-check my online passwords. Before the wedding, Paul asked if we could host the rehearsal dinner at my house, but Candace intervened, insisting it be at a rooftop restaurant overlooking the Chicago River, complete with a menu curated by a Michelin-starred chef, and I nodded politely while recalculating my budget. I spent an afternoon browsing decorative lights at Lowe's, picking out candles and seasonal decor for my own home, because even though the dinner wouldn't be there, I wanted my space to feel warm for the after party I imagined might happen, though it never did. While cleaning the pantry, I found a stack of coupons for CVS and Walgreens, reminders of years spent penny pinching and hunting for deals, habits that felt suddenly outdated in the face of a wedding planner who discussed floral arrangements like Wall Street mergers. The bridal shower was hosted at a country club with marble floors and a view of manicured greens, and I showed up with a carefully wrapped gift from Williams-Sonoma, only to find out later that Candace's registry app had been updated after my purchase, rendering my choice off-brand. I laughed it off and told myself that new couples should be allowed to have preferences, but I kept the receipt in a folder next to my insurance documents, a small act of quiet rebellion that gave me comfort late at night. My friend Barbara, a retired teacher, often joined me for coffee at our local Dunkin', and she listened patiently as I vented about table assignments and text messages. She reminded me that sometimes younger people test boundaries to see how far they can push before someone says no. Barbara shared her own tale of a daughter-in-law who tried to move into her lake house without asking, and how she resolved it through a combination of clear communication and a well-timed consult with a lawyer, planting the seed that my story might require legal wisdom too. During one particularly tense week, I escaped to the Art Institute of Chicago to wander through the Impressionist wing, where Monet's water lilies calmed my nerves and reminded me that life contains beauty even when the brushstrokes look chaotic up close. I sat on a bench near a painting and listened to a voicemail from Paul asking if I could co-sign a car loan for Candace's new Lexus, and I pressed delete, unwilling to commit to another financial entanglement without a serious conversation about expectations and respect. At my hairdresser's salon, surrounded by the smell of shampoo and gossip about local real estate, I overheard a woman mention she had used Rocket Mortgage to buy a condo quickly, and it sparked my curiosity about how mortgages could be transferred or sold, a thread that would later unravel into my revenge strategy. On Sundays, I attended services at our Baptist church, singing hymns and passing the offering plate, and the pastor's sermon on Proverbs about setting boundaries without losing love resonated deeply, causing me to scribble notes on the back of the program for future reference. I called my cousin June in Texas to confide, and she told me about the Silent No More videos she watched after her own daughter married a selfish man, and she encouraged me to share my story one day, saying that collective wisdom helps heal collective wounds. Late one night, after Candace sent a scathing email about seating charts, I sat at my kitchen table under the warm glow of a lamp from Target and wrote a letter to myself, describing my feelings in detail, an act of self-validation that later became part of my script. When Paul asked why I didn't want to travel to Napa for their wine tasting, I explained that my arthritis flares up on long flights and that my retirement budget didn't include luxury trips. And he shrugged, half listening as he scrolled through his Verizon phone. Candace once joked that I lived like it was still 1999 because I use paper planners and a consumer cellular phone. And I smiled, knowing that analog habits had saved me from scams more than once, including a phishing attempt disguised as a streaming bill from Xfinity. The week before the wedding, I ironed my red dress, spraying it lightly with Febreze and recalling how John always said I looked beautiful in that color, a memory that both comforted and haunted me as I prepared for an event that would upend our family dynamic. On the morning of the ceremony, while curling my hair in the bathroom, I listened to talk radio about Illinois property taxes and thought about how the proceeds from my lottery win were helping me weather them without stress, another blessing I kept quietly to myself. At the venue, I overheard Candace's bridesmaids whispering about the cost of the open bar and speculating that my gift would be small because I lived modestly, and I smiled inwardly, already knowing that appearances can be deceiving in both directions. During dinner, while buttering a roll and listening to speeches, I noticed Candace's mother glance at me when I praised the beef tenderloin, as if waiting for me to say something tacky. I kept my comments gracious, refusing to give them ammunition. When the chair was yanked from under me, the sensation of weightlessness followed by the shock of impact sent a flash of my entire life across my eyes, and I thought of John, my lottery ticket, my long nights at the hospital, and the choice about to be made. In the days following the wedding, I replayed the scene like a movie, analyzing every expression, every laugh, and every glance, asking myself if I had missed earlier warnings that could have prevented such a public humiliation. I also analyzed my own complicity, acknowledging that my desire to keep the peace had led me to silence discomfort, and resolving that my next steps would be guided by firm boundaries and calm, methodical action rather than simmering resentment. The first time I met with my lawyer, the receptionist offered me a glass of iced water and a pen with the firm's logo, and I felt the weight of the decision I was making as I described the wedding incident in clinical, unemotional terms to a stranger trained in law. We discussed the concept of a revocable trust, the difference between a trustee and a beneficiary, and how to structure my estate to protect assets while leaving room for reconciliation. And I appreciated the clarity legal language can bring to messy family situations. On the elevator ride down, I chatted with a paralegal about the best lunch spots near the courthouse, and she recommended a deli known for its Reubens, which I later tried and enjoyed alone at a corner table while pondering my next move. Researching mortgage servicing became a new hobby. I read articles on NerdWallet, watched YouTube explainers, and even attended a free seminar at the public library, where a retired banker explained how portfolios are bought and sold, scribbling notes with a pen from State Farm. I created a detailed spreadsheet on my old Dell desktop, listing possible companies to purchase the condo note from and cross-referencing them with public records. I felt like a detective uncovering a paper trail rather than a grandmother plotting revenge. Between research sessions, I still volunteered at the hospital, pushing wheelchairs and distributing Ensure nutrition shakes to patients, and the contrast between nurturing strangers and strategizing against my own family created a cognitive dissonance I navigated with prayer and journaling. When I finally executed the purchase through an LLC, I signed the documents at a title company's office, scented with fresh coffee and photocopy toner, my heart pounding even though the clerk treated the transaction as routine business. At home, I filed every document in a fireproof safe next to my will and my mother's heirloom jewelry, aware that physical copies provide security in a digital age where servers can crash and emails can vanish without warning. Candace's phone call after receiving the mortgage notice was laced with both panic and entitlement, and her voice cracked when she realized she didn't know the new servicer's name. I sipped my tea and listened, resisting the urge to gloat. Her rant reminded me of the way she once criticized the way I folded napkins, and I considered how often small comments revealed deeper disregard, promising myself to pay attention to these clues in future interactions with anyone, not just family. There were moments during my plan when I questioned whether I was being too harsh, like when I saw Paul's tired face after a long shift and wondered if I should simply hand over the trust and avoid conflict altogether. Then I would remember the sting of the hardwood floor on my palms and the sound of Candace's command for me to stay down, and I would reaffirm my commitment to seeing the plan through, not to punish, but to educate. In the weeks when payment notices went out, I scheduled self-care days, walking through the Morton Arboretum to admire the changing leaves, and reminding myself that nature endures seasons with grace, an analogy that comforted me during emotional storms. When the foreclosure notice was drafted, my lawyer reiterated that the court date would be at least 90 days out, a timeline that prevented the story from spiraling into the unrealistic world of television dramas where justice is instant. Friends who didn't know the details asked why I seemed so calm, and I half-joked that I had discovered a new hobby in reading legal documents, a statement that made them laugh and made me feel less like a villain and more like a scholar. I mailed letters certified through the United States Postal Service, tracking each delivery like a hawk and appreciating the reliability of government services we often take for granted until we need proof of receipt. Meanwhile, my nightly routine included stretching exercises recommended by Silver Sneakers, a program I joined through my Medicare plan, because I knew a sound mind requires a healthy body, especially when stress threatens to manifest as physical pain. Paul asked me once if I was lonely living alone after John, and now possibly losing him, and I replied honestly that solitude can be empowering when you fill it with purpose rather than pity, a truth I hoped he would someday understand. On a rare day off, I visited Wrigley Field to watch a Cubs game with Barbara, savoring the smell of hot dogs and freshly mowed grass, and I noticed a father teaching his daughter how to keep score, a sight that made me hopeful for Paul and Grace. Barbara and I also took a pottery class at a community center, our hands covered in clay, and she reminded me that shaping something beautiful from a lump of earth requires pressure and patience, just like shaping a healthy family dynamic. In a moment of weakness, I nearly called the mortgage company to cancel the late fee, but a voicemail from Candace complaining about my draconian rules hardened my resolve, and I instead sent a second reminder as outlined in the contract. Paul invited me to his workplace family picnic at a nearby park, and I went, meeting his colleagues who spoke highly of his leadership skills, and I saw the pride he felt when introducing me, which reassured me that our bond wasn't permanently broken. At the picnic, a coworker's wife mentioned that her mother-in-law had given them a Ring doorbell as a wedding gift, and I chuckled internally, appreciating the irony that sometimes technology and boundaries come wrapped in the same package. During one of our financial counseling sessions, the advisor from Wells Fargo explained the difference between adjustable rate and fixed-rate mortgages, and I noticed Candace taking notes diligently, humbled by the knowledge she had previously dismissed as boring. The counselor recommended budgeting apps and even suggested setting up an automatic deposit from their checking to savings each month, a simple step that can prevent panic. And I wondered why no one had taught her this in school or at home. I joined a support group for mothers at a local library where we sat in a circle of folding chairs and discussed boundaries. And one woman told me she had been manipulated into co-signing a car loan for her daughter's fiancé, a mistake she regretted dearly. Hearing other women's stories strengthened my conviction that my plan, though unorthodox, was not cruel but protective of my dignity and finances, a stance that many of them applauded quietly. On a Saturday morning, I met with my pastor to seek counsel, and he reminded me of Matthew 10:16. Be wise as serpents and harmless as doves, a verse that aligned with my intent to be strategic without malice. When Candace showed up crying on Halloween, I offered her a tissue and a seat by the fireplace, and as she opened up about her childhood, I felt my resentment softening, replaced by empathy for a woman still carrying wounds from her own parents. We discovered that her father had left her mother for a younger woman, that she grew up hearing that men leave unless you keep them happy, and that her controlling behavior stemmed from fear rather than pure spite, a revelation that reframed my perspective. In our subsequent conversations, I shared stories of my own childhood in rural Kentucky, where poverty and pride often collided, and we bonded over the fact that survival teaches resourcefulness but can also breed scarcity mindsets. Candace apologized for the wedding humiliation with tears and trembling hands, and I accepted, reminding her that forgiveness is a process and that rebuilding trust requires actions over time, not just words. We created a new plan together. She would attend therapy to address control issues. I would spend time with her without Paul present to build our relationship independently. And we both agreed to call each other out respectfully when old patterns resurfaced. There were setbacks, like when she passive-aggressively asked me to babysit at the last minute and I declined, or when I questioned her spending and she bristled. But we used these moments to practice boundary setting instead of descending into resentment. Grace's birth was a turning point. Seeing that tiny life made everything else seem trivial, and I vowed to protect her from toxic dynamics by modeling healthy conflict resolution and unconditional love without sacrificing my own dignity. I spent afternoons rocking Grace to sleep while humming hymns, her small fingers wrapped around mine, and I wondered what stories she would tell about her Nana when she grew up and faced her own family challenges. As Grace learned to walk, I noticed Candace watching me more closely, sometimes asking for advice on potty training or teething, and these requests warmed my heart because they represented trust rather than manipulation. Paul learned to defer to Candace less and to stand up for what he believed, even if it meant an awkward conversation. And I saw his confidence grow, a reward that validated the discomfort of our earlier conflict. We started new traditions, like Sunday potlucks, where each person brought a dish and a story from their week. And this ritual created space for laughter and venting without judgment, fostering a sense of community we had lacked. I made a point of mentioning brands like Clorox or Tide in conversations with Candace while we folded laundry together, demonstrating that I engage with modern products without being beholden to consumerism, and she reciprocated by sharing her favorite skin creams. During one particularly candid conversation, Candace admitted she had assumed I was poor because I drove an older Camry and shopped at thrift stores. And I told her that frugality is not the same as poverty, a lesson I hope she teaches Grace. I told her about the time I bought a gently used Coach purse at a consignment shop and used the savings to donate to a Meals on Wheels program, illustrating that priorities shape spending far more than appearances. Candace laughed, confessing that she once maxed out a credit card on a Black Friday sale at Macy's and regretted it for months, and we bonded over the universal experience of financial mistakes and the shame they carry. We also bonded over cooking. She learned to make my mother's cornbread recipe in a cast-iron skillet, and I learned her shortcut for creamy mashed potatoes using Philadelphia cream cheese, proving that traditions can evolve without losing their essence. Our evolving relationship didn't erase the hurt of the wedding day, but it layered new memories atop the painful ones, creating a textured history that acknowledged both harm and healing. On a rainy day, Candace invited me to a yoga class at the YMCA, and though I wobbled in downward dog, I appreciated her effort to share her world with me, and we laughed at our respective lack of flexibility. We even began to share more about finances. I explained the concept of compound interest to her using Grace's piggy bank as an example, and she taught me about apps like Venmo and Zelle, bridging a generational gap in practical ways. As months turned into years, I noticed that the anger I once felt had morphed into compassion, not because I forgot the disrespect, but because I understood the pain that fueled it and recognized my own capacity for grace. The trust I established remained revocable. a financial safety net, and a reminder that boundaries can include flexible provisions, and I updated it yearly, sometimes with the assistance of a notary at UPS store, to reflect changing dynamics and tax laws. I also updated my will to include donations to the local food bank, the shelter I support, and a scholarship fund at the community college for single parents pursuing nursing, ensuring that my wealth would continue to uplift those who need it most. Traveling to see my siblings in Kentucky became easier with my finances in order. I took the Amtrak down through the rolling hills, reading novels and making friends with fellow travelers who shared stories of family drama, each one affirming that my situation wasn't unique. On one trip, I chatted with a woman named Marion who told me she had given her son a down payment on a house, only to have his wife kick her out at Thanksgiving, and we laughed ruefully at the parallel and exchanged numbers. Marion later called to say that after hearing my story, she opened her own revocable trust and set up a meeting with her credit union, illustrating how our experiences ripple outward to empower others, a responsibility I don't take lightly. Some evenings I sit on my porch with a quilt and a mug of chamomile, listening to the distant sirens and thinking about how Chicago has changed since I was a girl, and I feel grateful for stability amid change. Other nights, I watch old VHS tapes of Paul's first steps, his high school graduation, and family Christmases, and though tears sometimes fall, they're often tears of pride rather than pain. We still have disagreements. Candace and I argue about politics, about screen time for Grace, and about whether to brine a turkey. But these conflicts occur on a foundation of mutual respect rather than contempt. Paul sometimes jokes that I should have become a lawyer given how much I enjoy reading contracts now, and I remind him that life taught me these skills the hard way, and I hope he never stops learning from my example. At church potlucks, I share my story in snippets to women who confide similar frustrations, and I advise them to document everything, keep receipts, and never feel guilty about protecting themselves. Practical wisdom I wish I had earlier. Writing this script has been cathartic, revisiting the ache and the resolution, and I hope it serves as both a cautionary tale and a beacon, showing that revenge need not be venomous to be effective. I often return to Silent No More videos when I need reassurance that speaking up helps others. The comment sections are filled with women and men from places like Atlanta, Phoenix, and Des Moines, all sharing their own stories of betrayal and boundaries. The anonymity of the lottery win reminds me that wealth doesn't define character. Some of the richest people I met at the bank had the least grace, while some of the poorest extended the most generosity when they had little to give. Grace once asked me why I work so hard reading all those big books at my age, and I told her that learning keeps you alive, that curiosity is a gift, and that our minds need exercise just like our bodies. I take her to the library often, encouraging her to choose books about astronomy and history, hoping to instill in her a love of knowledge that will serve her when she navigates her own adult relationships. There's a small journal I keep in my nightstand where I record lessons learned from each major family conflict, and the entry following the wedding reads, "Never underestimate quiet mothers," a phrase I underline every time I read it. My involvement with the county clerk's office introduced me to the bureaucracy of probate court, and I now help other seniors file forms correctly, ensuring they aren't taken advantage of by unscrupulous relatives or predatory lenders. At least once a month, I schedule a call with my financial advisor to review my accounts, discuss market fluctuations, and reassess my risk tolerance, because proactive management beats reactive panic every time. I also installed a new security system from ADT after noticing a spike in burglaries in our neighborhood. A reminder that safety extends beyond emotional boundaries to physical protection of our homes and loved ones. When a neighbor asked if I regretted not giving Paul and Candace the $10 million, I answered honestly that I didn't, because the lessons learned were worth more than any check could have provided them at that time. Candace once joked that her friends envy her savage mother-in-law, and I laughed, telling her that my savagery is actually strategic compassion wrapped in legalese. a line she later quoted to me during a Thanksgiving toast. The stability we achieved didn't happen overnight. It required uncomfortable conversations, missed holidays, sleepless nights, therapy sessions, and a willingness to see each other as flawed but redeemable humans, rather than villains and victims. Grace is now 5 and starting kindergarten, and she proudly tells her teachers that her Nana helps people with money and that her parents always pay bills on time. Unprompted testimonials to the quiet shift in our family culture. She also carries a lunchbox I bought her from Target with a little note I slip inside reminding her to be kind, brave, and honest. And those same words serve as a daily mantra for me, too. When I think about Candace's original words to me at the wedding, they still sting, but the sting has become more of a scar than an open wound, a reminder of where we've been, rather than where we are. In therapy, I learned that holding on to grudges is like drinking poison, expecting the other person to suffer. So I decided to channel my energy into constructive actions that uplift rather than corrode, and this story is one of those actions. The scholarship fund I established now supports 4 students, 2 studying nursing, 1 in auto mechanics, and 1 in accounting, and their thank you letters bring tears to my eyes because they represent hope growing from hurt. Paul recently started taking night classes in business management, inspired by our many discussions about finances, and he told me he wants to eventually move into HR to create fair policies for employees, a goal that makes me beam with pride. Candace has been promoted twice at her marketing firm and now mentors younger women, teaching them the importance of humility and listening. Lessons she said she learned the hard way thanks to me. Our family still isn't perfect. No family is. But we have learned to communicate directly, to schedule regular check-ins, and to hold space for each other's feelings without dismissing them as overreactions or dramatics. There are still holidays where tension flickers like a candle in a drafty room, but we now know how to protect the flame instead of letting the wind snuff it out. An analogy I share with Grace when she asks why adults sometimes whisper. I keep a basket of toddler toys in my living room, and when Grace visits, she plays on the rug where I once fell, unaware of the history of that floor, a circle of healing that brings me solace. Sometimes I wonder what might have happened if Candace hadn't pulled that chair, if I'd given them the check, and if we had continued with superficial harmony, and I realize we might never have addressed deeper issues. As painful as it was, the incident served as a catalyst for transformation, a chance to reset the dynamics and to teach all of us, including Grace, about respect, accountability, and the strength of quiet resolve. There's a part of me that thanks Candace for revealing her true character early, because hidden resentment can poison relationships slowly, whereas open conflict forces decisions that can lead to healthier outcomes. When I posted my story on Silent No More, I was nervous about judgment, but the comments were overwhelmingly supportive, full of women from Chicago to Sacramento who said they felt seen, validating my decision to share. Paul watched the video and texted me that he had cried, that hearing my perspective in full made him appreciate the depth of my hurt and the courage it took to stand up for myself. Candace commented anonymously, admitting she had been cruel and thanking the community for holding her accountable, a gesture that showed me she had absorbed the lessons far beyond our family meetings. I responded privately to her comment, reinforcing my belief that public accountability combined with private reconciliation creates lasting change, a principle I now share with other women in my advocacy work. Barbara teased me that I had become a minor celebrity in our senior circle, and I laughed, telling her I was just a grandmother with a story and a willingness to speak it aloud without shame. When Grace is old enough to understand the entire story, I plan to read her this script, not to vilify her mother, but to teach her about resilience, choices, and the importance of treating everyone at the table with dignity. I've also learned to savor mundane moments, like peeling apples for pie or arranging flowers from Trader Joe's on my table, because life's grand dramas are punctuated by small acts that make a house feel like a home. As I near 70, I am acutely aware that time is the most precious currency, and I choose to invest mine in people and causes that reflect my values rather than in maintaining appearances or appeasing those who disregard me. The older women at church often say that as you age, you earn the right to speak your mind, and I think that right begins the moment you decide your self-respect is non-negotiable, regardless of your age. This journey has taught me that revenge can be redefined as rebalancing, that justice need not be cruel, and that sometimes the most powerful move is to sit quietly at your own table until others learn how to treat you. In my living room hangs a framed quote from Maya Angelou. When people show you who they are, believe them the first time. And I smile whenever I read it because it took me 66 years, a lottery win, and a humiliating fall to fully internalize those words. Setting boundaries didn't come naturally to me. Growing up in a household where women were expected to smile and serve, I had to unlearn decades of conditioning that equated silence with virtue, a process that required constant self-reminders written on sticky notes by my stove. Sometimes I would rehearse conversations with Candace in my head while washing dishes with Dawn soap, anticipating her responses and practicing calm phrases like, "I hear you, but this doesn't work for me," so that my tongue wouldn't betray my nerves when the real moment came. I also began to notice how often my friends complained about feeling invisible, whether at family gatherings or at grocery checkout lines. And I resolved to never dismiss someone's feelings simply because they come wrapped in years of life and wrinkles. On a road trip to Michigan with Barbara, we stopped at a Cracker Barrel for breakfast, and between bites of biscuits, we talked about our mothers, their sacrifices, and how they would marvel at the ways modern women juggle career, family, and social expectations. Driving back, the autumn leaves blazing red and gold, I pondered how my own mother would have handled Candace. She was a fiery woman who once returned a defective crock pot to Sears without a receipt, refusing to leave until she got a refund, a story I often replay for courage. I joined an online forum through AARP that discussed intergenerational conflict, and reading other women's stories made me feel less isolated. One post from a woman in Oregon mirrored mine almost exactly, and we exchanged messages comparing notes on lawyers and counselors. At home, I reorganized my filing cabinet, labeling folders with bold Sharpie letters, and discovered receipts from decades past, grocery lists totaling $10, canceled checks with the Bank of America logo, and a postcard Paul sent from a middle school trip to Springfield with a drawing of the Capitol. Each piece of paper was a time capsule, a tactile reminder that history is written in ink in grocery store receipts as much as in photo albums. And I smiled, thinking about how my grandchildren might one day marvel at printed statements instead of scrolling screens. There were days when I felt weary of the emotional labor. On those days, I brewed an extra pot of Folgers, pulled on my worn Chicago Bears sweatshirt, and let myself rest, understanding that healing requires downtime as much as action. In conversations with Candace, I sometimes referenced my own early years of marriage, when John and I argued about trivial things, like whether to buy generic or brand-name detergent, small stories that humanized me beyond the role of mother-in-law and invited her to see me as a woman with a past. I also told her about the time Paul failed his driver's test because he couldn't parallel park, and how John took him out again the next weekend until he mastered it, demonstrating that patience and repetition often achieve more than lectures and criticism. Candace shared stories about her college days at Northwestern University, how she juggled internships at tech startups and waitressing shifts at a pizza joint, and I felt my respect for her hustle grow even as I maintained vigilance around her boundaries. One afternoon, we watched an old episode of Oprah together, sipping chamomile tea from mugs Paul bought at Costco, and Oprah's guest spoke about forgiveness as a gift you give yourself. We looked at each other and nodded, absorbing wisdom from someone who had navigated public criticism with grace. I became more intentional about complimenting Candace genuinely, praising her presentation at work or her patience with Grace, while also keeping my standards for respect clear, ensuring that kindness didn't get misinterpreted as weakness. During spring cleaning, I donated several bags of clothes to Goodwill, including dresses I had once envisioned wearing to fancy events. Releasing them felt symbolic, like shedding expectations about how my life should look and embracing how it actually unfolded. Barbara and I attended a seminar at our community college on digital literacy for seniors, where we learned how to use password managers and two-factor authentication, practical tools that made me feel empowered rather than intimidated by technology, and I later taught Candace how to set up her own account. The more I learned, the more I realized that taking charge of my finances and my narrative wasn't just about me. It was about modeling resilience for Grace, showing her that women of any age can navigate complex systems and stand up for themselves. I decided to share parts of my story at a women's luncheon hosted by our church. Standing behind a podium with my knees shaking slightly, I described the chair incident and the steps I took afterward, and the room fell silent as heads nodded in recognition and approval. Afterward, a young woman approached me, tears in her eyes, and said she planned to confront her boyfriend's disrespectful behavior, adding that my story had given her courage. And I hugged her, realizing my pain had been alchemized into someone else's empowerment. In quiet moments, I sometimes lit a candle and wrote prayers for each family member, including Candace, asking for wisdom and patience. These small rituals grounded me when emotions threatened to spiral into resentment or martyrdom. When Grace started asking more questions about her family history, I pulled out a shoebox filled with letters John wrote to me during our courtship, yellowing pages scented faintly of Old Spice, and we read them together, laughing at his corny jokes and marveling at his neat handwriting. Sharing those letters with Grace felt like closing a circle, connecting past love to present healing, and I realized that keeping traditions alive doesn't require rigid adherence. It requires intention and storytelling, elements Candace eventually embraced in her own way. I also shared with Grace the darker parts of our history when she was old enough, like the moment her mother pulled my chair, not to vilify but to illustrate that families can overcome cruelty through accountability, apologies, and growth. There were months when I didn't spend any of the lottery money, letting it sit quietly in accounts, accruing interest and waiting for direction. This financial patience mirrored the emotional patience I cultivated during our family's reconstruction. Eventually, I used some funds to sponsor a local high school robotics team, buying them laptops and tools from Micro Center. Watching those teenagers compete with machines they built reminded me that investment in youth yields dividends beyond dollars. I also donated to a program that provided legal counsel to grandparents seeking visitation rights, drawing on my own experience and recognizing that institutional support can change outcomes for families far more effectively than solitary anger. At one point, I considered buying myself a new car to replace my aging Camry, test driving a Lexus and a Honda Accord, but I decided against it, preferring the reliability of my paid-off vehicle and the memories it carried from soccer practices and road trips. On Sundays, after church, I would drive past the condominium I technically owned through the mortgage and smile at the fact that power can be exercised silently without ever setting foot inside a building you control on paper. Sometimes I imagined renting that property out to a nice family if Paul and Candace ever defaulted, picturing a young couple barbecuing on the balcony, unaware of the drama once associated with their address, and this daydream reminded me that no situation is permanent. I kept track of market trends, noting when interest rates dipped or when property values rose, not because I intended to flip homes, but because knowledge is armor against manipulation, a truth I wish all women internalized sooner. Paul began to consult me on his financial decisions, asking about mortgage refinancing and retirement contributions, and I provided guidance without strings attached, remembering that empowerment, not control, was my goal in our renewed relationship. Candace's friends sometimes joked about my finance guru vibes, And though the phrase made me chuckle, it also made me proud, because stepping into expertise at 60 plus is a testament to lifelong learning. There was a time when I considered telling Paul about the lottery win before the wedding, writing drafts of letters I never sent, each one torn up and recycled, because something inside me knew the timing wasn't right, an intuition I've learned to trust. I think about intuition often now. I teach Grace to listen to the little voice inside her, to pause before saying yes or no, to trust her gut, because that inner compass saved me from making emotionally driven, financially destructive decisions more than once. My phone now buzzes with reminders to check bank balances, pay property taxes, and schedule doctor's appointments, modern conveniences that lighten the cognitive load and free up mental space for reflection, reading, and writing. During one of my reflective walks along the lakefront, I encountered a young couple arguing about budgets, and I resisted the urge to interject. Instead, I silently wished them the wisdom to work it out without outside interference, knowing that unsolicited advice can backfire. The concept of revenge still makes some of my friends uncomfortable, and I clarify that my actions were about rebalancing power and teaching respect, not about causing harm for its own sake. Semantics matter when discussing sensitive family matters. I occasionally feel a pang of guilt when I see the stress in Paul's eyes during particularly tight months, but I remind myself that short-term discomfort fosters long-term growth, and that he has become a more conscientious provider because of these trials. Candace sometimes jokes about writing her own side of the story, and I encourage her, believing that multiple perspectives enrich collective understanding and can even inspire others to check their own behavior before repeating harmful patterns. Barbara remains my confidant. We exchange texts about grocery sales at Aldi and new episodes of shows on PBS. But beneath the mundane, we share a tacit agreement to hold each other accountable to our boundaries. A friendship that keeps me grounded. When we discuss our eventual passing, we laugh about the idea of our kids discovering our secret stashes of snacks and journals. And though death is a solemn topic, humor makes the inevitability less heavy, just like purposeful revenge makes betrayal less defining. I still volunteer at the hospital, and recently, a young nurse asked me for advice about dealing with a demanding patient. I told her that empathy paired with clear communication often eases tension, and she later reported that my approach worked, reinforcing the universality of boundary setting across contexts. That same nurse later recognized me from my Silent No More video and whispered that she admired my courage, and I was reminded yet again that vulnerability can become a bridge rather than a barrier when shared wisely. Sometimes at night, I hear Paul's car pull into my driveway unexpectedly, and my heart skips. But it's usually just him stopping by to drop off leftover barbecue or to ask for my opinion on a new DIY project he saw on HGTV. He recently installed a backsplash in their kitchen using tiles from Home Depot and proudly sent me pictures. And I responded with genuine praise, thinking about how our relationship has shifted from transactional to collaborative, a change that still feels miraculous. Candace once asked me what I would have done if she hadn't apologized, and I told her that I would have continued enforcing boundaries and protecting myself, because the principle remains even when apologies never come. She nodded, processing the weight of unconditional self-respect. When I speak at events now, I emphasize that financial literacy and emotional literacy are intertwined. Knowing the difference between a will and a trust can save you from heartbreak, just as knowing when to say no can save you from resentment. I encourage attendees to pick up books, listen to podcasts, and consult professionals, reminding them that ignorance is expensive, emotionally and financially, and that there's no shame in asking for guidance from a banker, a therapist, or a trusted friend. Once a man in the audience asked if my story had harmed my relationship with Candace permanently, and I answered that honesty harmed it temporarily but saved it long term. Because relationships built on appeasement crack under pressure, while those built on truth bend without breaking. After my talk, an older gentleman told me he regretted giving his son money without accountability, and that my story inspired him to renegotiate their arrangement. Proof that it's never too late to adjust terms for your own well-being. As the years progress, I spend more time tending to my garden, pulling weeds and watching tomatoes ripen on the vine, a meditative practice that mirrors the ongoing maintenance required to keep relationships healthy and thriving. I sometimes sprinkle Epsom salt around my hydrangeas to boost their blooms, and as I do, I think about how small acts of care yield vibrant results, just as small acts of respect yield lasting relationships. When Paul asked if he could borrow my truck to haul lumber, I hesitated before remembering the times John lent tools to neighbors without question, and I agreed with a caveat that he fill the gas tank at the Shell station afterward, a boundary couched in generosity. Shell's gas prices that day were surprisingly low, and Paul joked that maybe my frugal habits were contagious, and we shared a laugh, a simple moment that would have been impossible during the tension-filled months after the wedding. There are times when I still feel anger bubbling, like when I see a mother-in-law joked about on television as meddling or silly, and I change the channel, choosing to consume content that reflects the dignity of women who have held families together for generations. I've begun writing a memoir, not just about Candace, but about my entire life, from rural Kentucky to Chicago, from nursing school to lottery winnings, and the process has been healing, forcing me to confront and celebrate each chapter equally. Paul encourages me to include recipes and budgeting tips, saying that my practical wisdom deserves to be documented, and I chuckle, imagining a cookbook interspersed with legal advice. But maybe that's exactly what our community needs. Candace volunteered to help me format the document, her marketing skills finally benefiting me directly. And as we sat at our dining table sipping iced tea, I marveled at how far we'd come from the terse emails and passive-aggressive texts of years past. Grace, curious as ever, asked what we were writing, and Candace looked at me before answering, "We're writing about how to be brave." And my eyes welled because she had internalized the lesson I fought so hard to teach. From time to time, Paul will stop by after work, still in his Ford uniform, and we will sit on the porch, watching the sun set over the Sears Tower, talking about nothing and everything. We often end our evenings with laughter over stories of his childhood antics, like the time he mixed bleach and vinegar in the bathroom trying to clean, and I remind him to always read labels. Candace learned to cook and now invites me over, proudly serving dishes seasoned with just the right amount of love, and our conversations are laced with honesty rather than barbs. Grace, with curls like her father's and a stubborn chin like her mother's, calls me Nana and loves rummaging through my old photo albums, asking about people she never met. I tell her about her grandfather, John, a man who worked at the post office and taught Paul how to fish, and her eyes widen as she connects her lineage to a history of resilience. In those moments, I realized that my revenge was never about destroying anyone, but about restoring balance and ensuring that future generations learn respect and boundaries. I also realized that the $10 million I kept became a tool for good, funding scholarships and shelters, proving that wealth can be wielded with wisdom rather than impulse. When friends at church ask how I managed to navigate such a tangled family conflict, I tell them quietly that slow, steady steps and adherence to the law are more powerful than public outbursts. I remind them that in Illinois, two-party consent laws protect us but also prevent us from becoming secret recorders, and that changing your locks is legal when you own the house. But honesty prevents drama. I counsel them to read every contract, whether it's a mortgage or a cell phone agreement, because those clauses, like the ones I enforced, can either protect you or entrap you. As for Candace, she occasionally posts inspirational quotes on Facebook about growth and forgiveness, and sometimes she tags me, which makes me chuckle and shake my head. Paul now coaches Grace's soccer team at the park, wearing his U.S. Bank debit card on a lanyard because he jokes that it's his lucky charm. a nod to the life lessons he earned. At Thanksgiving, we gather around my table, the smell of turkey filling the house, and everyone helps set out plates from my mother's china, and there is no tension about where I belong. Candace carves the turkey, Paul pours the sweet tea, and Grace puts napkins by each plate, asking why there is an extra setting, and I tell her it's for anyone who needs refuge. After dinner, we play cards and share stories. And when Paul inevitably loses at gin rummy, he jokes that he can't win every hand, a metaphor we all understand now. In the quiet moments between laughter, I sometimes hear John's voice in my head, telling me he's proud of how I protected our family without losing myself. As I write this story for the Silent No More community, I hope other mothers see that asserting boundaries is not cruelty, but self-respect, and revenge can be a teaching tool when tempered with grace. Life has a way of testing our patience and our values, but with love, legal knowledge, and the occasional brand new lock from Lowe's, we can emerge stronger and more connected. You know that if you're listening and have been through something similar, know that you are not alone, that your dignity matters, and that sometimes the sweetest justice is living well and seeing change. Thank you for walking through my journey with me. I would love to know where you're listening from and what lessons you've learned, because our stories weave together like threads in a family quilt.